My name is Mandy. I'm 27 years old. For as long as I can remember, my entire life was basically built around one thing: making other people happy. I was the reliable one, the easygoing friend, the one who'd drop everything to help you out. I said yes when my body, my soul, and my gut were all screaming, no! I was a chameleon, changing my colors to match whoever was in the room, desperately hoping they'd approve. I thought this made me a good person. You know, kind, generous. But what it really was a quiet, slow-motion betrayal of myself. It left me drained, completely hollowed out, and simmering with this resentment I couldn't even put a name to. This isn't a story about becoming selfish or mean. It's the story of my breaking point and how choosing myself didn't push people away, but actually led to a radical, positive shift I never, ever thought was possible. This is the story of how I stopped trying to please them, and in doing so, finally found me. It all came to a head on a totally unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. There wasn't a big dramatic scene, no shouting match, no cinematic moment. It was quiet. I was at my desk, staring at an email from a senior colleague. They were asking, at the last minute, for me to take on a huge chunk of their project. You know, the same project they'd been complaining about for weeks. The deadline was that Friday. Saying yes would mean torpedoing my entire weekend. A quiet weekend I desperately needed just to recharge my completely empty batteries. I could feel that familiar dread washing over me, that cascade of obligations. The voice in my head was already writing the reply. Of course, happy to help. My fingers were literally hovering over the keyboard, ready to type out the words that would seal my miserable fate for the next 96 hours. But then, something snapped. It was a physical feeling, like a string pulled too tight for too long had finally broken. I caught my reflection in my dark computer screen. My eyes looked tired. My shoulders were slumped, and in that moment, I saw the truth. I was just a supporting character in everyone else's story. I was so busy being useful that I had forgotten to be alive. The resentment I'd been swallowing for years tasted like acid. I took a deep breath, and I typed 5 words that felt both terrifying and completely liberating. I can't this time, sorry. I didn't offer some long, drawn-out explanation. I didn't invent an excuse. I just said no. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it, my heart pounding in my chest. That was it. That was the moment I stopped trying to please them. And in the silence that followed, everything started to change. Looking back, it's so clear. You aren't born a people pleaser. You're made into one. For most of us, it's a survival strategy we picked up in childhood. Maybe your parents' love felt conditional, tied to your grades or how good you were. Or maybe you grew up in a house where conflict was the ultimate evil, so you learned that being agreeable was the fastest way to keep the peace. You got praised for being so easy, helpful, or low maintenance, and so you learned to bury your own needs to get that validation. For me, it was a mix of things. I was a sensitive kid, and I got really good at reading the emotional temperature of a room. If someone was upset, I instinctively felt like it was my job to fix it. There's actually a name for this. It's called fawning, and it's a trauma response where you try to appease people to feel safe. While I wouldn't call my childhood traumatic, there was this undercurrent of anxiety and a deep fear of rejection that drove me. This led to what psychologists call an anxious attachment style, where I was just constantly seeking reassurance, terrified of being disapproved of. So I became a master accommodator. I'd anticipate what people needed, smooth over arguments, and offer help before anyone even asked. And on the surface, it worked. People saw me as kind and super reliable. I was needed, and being needed felt like being valued. But here's the problem. That deep-seated need for external validation is a fragile, rickety foundation to build your self-worth on. I was so focused on what everyone else thought of me that I never bothered to ask myself what boys thought. My sense of self was outsourced, dependent on a constant drip feed of approval. If they were happy with me, I could be happy with myself. But if I sensed even a tiny hint of disapproval, my whole world felt like it was about to shatter. It was an exhausting way to live. This habit became so ingrained, I didn't even see it as a choice anymore. It was just who I was, or so I thought. The problem is, when you spend your life trying to be what everyone else wants, you eventually forget who you actually are. Does any of this sound familiar? Are you the one who always says yes, even when you're completely overwhelmed? Do you apologize for things that aren't even your fault? Do you avoid conflict like the plague, biting your tongue just to keep things smooth? Do you feel that pit of guilt in your stomach whenever you even think about putting yourself first? These are all classic signs of a people pleaser. For years, I told myself this was an asset, a sign of my kindness. But I was paying a heavy price every single day. First, there's the emotional cost. I lived with this constant low-grade anxiety, a quiet hum of what do they think of me. This state of constant vigilance is the fastest way to burn out. And under all that exhaustion was resentment. Every time I said yes when I meant no, it was like depositing a little drop of bitterness into a bank account I didn't know I had. Over time, it accrued some serious interest, poisoning my relationships from the inside. And that's the thing about the relationships. You'd think being so accommodating would lead to strong connections. But the opposite is true. My relationships were mostly one-sided and, honestly, pretty fake. Because I was never honest about my needs, people never got a chance to know the real me. They just knew the compliant, agreeable version I showed them. That doesn't build respect. It creates a dynamic where you give and they take. You end up feeling lonely even when you're surrounded by people, because nobody really sees you. Then, there are the real-world costs. My calendar was a disaster, packed with things I had no energy for, draining time from my own goals or just resting. My work suffered, not because I wasn't capable, but because I was spread way too thin, always taking on extra tasks to be a team player. This chronic overcommitment even affects your physical health. At my worst, I had digestive issues. I couldn't sleep, and I was just exhausted all the time. My body was screaming at me to stop, but I didn't know how to listen. But maybe the most devastating cost is what it does to your identity. When your worth is tied to how useful you are, you lose touch with your own value. I had trouble making even small decisions because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted anymore. My own preferences felt irrelevant. I had spent so much time mirroring others that my own reflection had become blurry. I was a stranger to myself. And that is a profoundly lonely place to be. So, back to that Tuesday. After I sent that terrifying no, the world didn't end. My colleague just replied, "No problem, thanks for letting me know." That was it. All those catastrophic scenarios I'd built up in my head. They were just stories, just my anxiety talking. The first step out of the people-pleasing trap isn't some big, heroic gesture. It's that quiet moment of recognizing the pattern for what it is. The journey back to myself wasn't a straight line, and it sure didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process of unlearning decades of conditioning. Here are the steps that actually worked for me. First, I had to completely reframe my mindset. I started by admitting that people-pleasing wasn't some character flaw, it was a coping strategy that had just outlived its usefulness. Shifting from self-judgment to self-compassion was huge. I also had to fight the core belief that saying no is selfish. I started to see that boundaries aren't about pushing people away. Boundaries are not walls, they are the clear, kind instructions you give people on how to have a healthy relationship with you. With that new mindset, I started journaling. Every night, I'd note any time I said yes when I wanted to say no, and what fear was behind it. Just tracking the behavior made the unconscious pattern conscious. That was the key. Next, I had to figure out what my own values were. I literally sat down and made a list: creativity, peace, authenticity. This list became my new compass. When someone asked me for something, instead of asking, "Will this make them happy?" I started asking, "Does this align with my values?" That question changed everything. Then came the scary part, actually practicing. I started small with what I called micro boundaries, saying no thank you to the store clerk, asking if I wanted a loyalty card, telling a telemarketer, "I'm not interested." These tiny wins built my confidence. I also came up with a few go-to phrases like, "I need to check my calendar and get back to you." That is a magic phrase. It gives you a pause button instead of that knee-jerk, anxious, yes. I also had to learn to be assertive, which is totally different from being aggressive. I started using I statements. Instead of, "You're asking for too much," I'd practice saying, "I feel overwhelmed when I take on extra work right now." It's a small shift, but it takes ownership of your feelings instead of placing blame. And this was a big one. I realized I am not responsible for other people's emotional reactions. It is not my job to manage their disappointment if I set a healthy boundary. Trying to control how they feel is an impossible, anxiety-fueled task. Finally, and this is the most important part, I started practicing relentless self-compassion. When I slipped up, and I did plenty of times, I treated it as a lesson, not a failure. I started carving out non-negotiable time for myself, even if it was just 15 minutes to read or do nothing. These small acts reinforced the message that my time and energy are valuable and that I am worthy of my own care. So what happened? What does life look like when you stop building it around everyone else's approval? In a word, everything. The first thing I noticed was a surge of energy. It was like I'd been running a dozen power-hungry apps on a phone with 10% battery. By closing all those unnecessary tabs, my energy came flooding back. And my relationships? This was the part that scared me the most. I was so afraid everyone would leave me. And I'm not going to lie, some relationships did fade. The ones that were based on me just being endlessly useful. They drifted away. And yeah, that hurt. But it was also like a filter. It showed me which connections were based on mutual respect and which were just based on my utility. The relationships that were left got so much deeper and more real. Healthy relationships don't just survive boundaries, they thrive on them. My mental health completely transformed. That background hum of anxiety faded away. I felt a stable sense of self-worth that didn't depend on praise. I started to trust myself. I even got better at my job. With more energy and fewer obligations, my focus shot through the roof. I started taking on projects I was actually passionate about, not just the ones I felt I should do. But the biggest change was this feeling of finally coming home to myself. I rediscovered old hobbies. I started making choices based on what I wanted. It was like meeting an old friend I hadn't seen in years and realizing I actually really like this person. There's a quiet power that comes from knowing you won't abandon yourself, and that feeling is better than any external validation you could ever get. Okay, so a couple of really important things to mention here. First, my journey is just that. My journey. For a lot of people, people-pleasing is deeply rooted in trauma. It's that fawn response. If this sounds like you, this work is so much more effective and safer with the support of a trauma-informed therapist. Second, get ready for some pushback. Not everyone in your life is going to throw you a party when you start setting boundaries. Your change messes with the dynamic they were comfortable with. So start small, stay firm, and always prioritize your safety. Changing a lifetime of programming isn't a quick fix. It's a daily practice. You'll stumble, but you can always begin again. You teach people how to treat you by how you treat yourself. My whole journey started with one tiny, terrifying no. So my invitation to you is this. Find one small, low-stakes opportunity this week to set a micro-boundary. Just pause before you automatically say yes. Ask yourself, am I doing this because I genuinely want to, or because I'm afraid of their disapproval? And if you feel up to it, share your own story or your goal in the comments. Reading each other's experiences makes us all feel less alone. The freedom you're looking for is on the other side of the yes you were taught to give. The life that is truly yours is waiting for you to claim it.